So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, you two, the Dapper Dinosaur here. We are back for our third foray into the dank, dark, moldy, and mendacious mind of Thomas Kindell, a creationist most notable for sounding a little bit like Darth Vader without a filter. Last time, he had tried to use dinosaur soft tissue finds without seeming to know, even at the most basic level, what he was even talking about, confusing permineralized soft tissue in Cambrian non-biomineralized fossils from Lagerstätten with molecular fossils in some Mesozoic animals, especially dinosaurs, while also seeming to think that the soft tissue molecules were found intact, and then using a paper that did not test any preservation methods to pretend that there were no methods of preservation, and also making up some incoherent nonsense about alpha particles. Now he's here to talk about carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. Well, there's no sense in further delay, so let's go.
We also have the problem that carbon-14 disappears rapidly. It has a relatively rapid half-life of only 5,730 years.
I guess that's rapid compared to some half-lives, but it's also glacially slow compared to others. But I don't know if that matters.
Which means in 10 half-lives, about 57,000 years, less than 60,000 years, there's not much left. And you get much past 100,000 years, it'd be very difficult to detect any of it.
It depends on the initial sample, but yes, in most circumstances, much past 50,000 years, any organic sample will have a carbon-14 presence that's too low to distinguish from background noise, which will never be zero. And now I realize he's almost certainly going to find examples of samples of known ages, point out that the background noise carbon-14 reading was found, and then, because creationists pretend that that's finding carbon-14 in the samples, he's going to say that really the fossils are much younger. Let's hope I'm wrong about that.
Yet, in all these specimens where they took rigorous measures to rule out the possibility of contamination, they found in a hadrosaur dinosaur, a Montosaurus specimen, a Pharodeus specimen, another hadrosaur, a Triceratops, ancient axlewood, drumheller wood, etc., which are supposed to be, again, millions of years old. They all had very measurable amounts of carbon-14.
So this is all taken from radiocarbon in dinosaur and other fossils by longtime antagonists to truth Brian Thomas and Vance Nelson in the Creation Research Quarterly in 2015. And it is true that most of these were probably actual detection of carbon-14 in these fossils, but the question is, did it actually come from these organisms in question, or is it extrinsic carbon-14 that comes from known sources? Well, let's see what else Kindell has for us.
And it usually falls in the parameters of about 20 to 45,000 years. Most of them fall within that range.
Most of the ones I see are in excess of 40,000 years, and I don't think Kindell has done a survey on this. I think he's just basing it on this one Brian Thomas source. I must say, though, that it is nice to actually be able to read a source from Kindell. It's even linked in the description. I think this might be the first time he's cited anything properly. And by properly, I don't mean with perfect citation formatting or anything. Just cited with enough information that I can find the exact source he's using. That's all I ask for.
No matter how far up and down the geological column you go, they all seem to have about the same amount of carbon-14 in them.
Ironically, this is not true in the results we're shown, as the overall trend in the Thomas source is in fact that fossils from higher in the stratigraphic column actually do tend to give younger ages in Thomas results, although the correlation isn't great, and I suspect a wider survey would probably reveal a more or less random distribution of ages. This should itself cause pause, since in archaeological context, creationists tend to accept carbon dating, meaning that if it is in their mind at least reliable enough within the last couple thousand years, and should at least be good for relative, if not absolute, dating beyond that. But since these fossils don't tend to neatly fall into a chronological order, that should mean, on the basis of young Earth creationism, that in fact what is being measured here is not age. The other option, of course, is that young Earth creationists can simply get rid of their trust in carbon dating wholesale, but then that would remove some of the archaeological evidence for the historicity of various parts of the Bible that they actually do want to accept. What a quandary. Luckily for them, intellectual honesty and having internally consistent beliefs aren't exactly a priority for the average young Earth creationist, so it doesn't really matter for them.
Interestingly, some animals don't absorb it at the same rate, but close enough to it so that you'd have a little wiggle room there.
I'm not sure what he means by this. I suspect he might be talking about things like the fact that organisms near industrial sources of carbon dioxide emissions, or near nuclear blasts, or who just live in the ocean, often give incorrect dates when these factors are not taken into account. because these sources of carbon dioxide are not representative of the concentration of carbon-14 in the atmosphere broadly as caused by radiation from space. Interestingly, these are all called out in one of the only non-creationist sources cited by Thomas. Carbon background. Does it have multiple personalities? By M.J. Nadeau. Also, Thomas cites Andrew Snelling at least 6 times to give you an idea of the quality of research we're talking about here. Casually citing a known liar like Andrew Snelling isn't exactly a good sign.
But none of them should have any detectable carbon-14 in them after a bit over 100,000 years.
Wrong.
None of them should have detectable carbon-14 from the organism, and there's no reason to think that any of them do. But there are numerous reasons to suspect all of them, maybe except the Captorinus, had carbon-14 from other sources. This is especially true since, other than one sample, that's ironically not even on Kindell's slide, there's no reason to think any original biological material from the organism was left, meaning that no matter how old the fossils are, no matter what Thomas et fam measured, it sure wasn't carbon-14 that could establish an age for these fossils.
Theoretically, after 250,000 years, there simply wouldn't be a single atom of carbon-14 that had not decayed back into nitrogen-14.
That's not how math works. A half-life describes an exponential decay rate, such that after one half-life, half the original sample will have decayed, after 2 half-lives, 3/4 of it will have decayed, after 3 half-lives, 7/8 of it will have decayed, and so on. The expected remainder as a fraction of the original sample that will be undecayed after a given time can be given with the formula 1/2 to the n, where n is the number of half-lives that have passed. 250,000 is about 4.4 half-lives of carbon-14, so if we plug that into the formula, we find that after 250,000 years, there should be about 4.737% of the original carbon-14 left. That's not none.
So there simply wouldn't be anything to measure after just 250,000 years.
Fun fact, there are actually no numbers you can put in as the exponent that will give you an expected remaining fraction of 0. Now, in real life, there will be a final carbon-14 nucleus which will decay, but how long that will take is not something that can be simply calculated, as spontaneous nuclear decay is, in fact, stochastic, not deterministic.
But we find very measurable amounts. Now, why do they vary between about 20 to 45,000 years? I believe is because the evolutionists don't take into account the fact that in the recent past, the Earth's magnetic field was several times more powerful than it is today.
I don't see how that's going to matter. The flood was only about a year long. The alleged magnetic field shenanigans would probably have taken less time than that, and so I don't see why that would scramble up the radiocarbon ages of a bunch of organisms who died in the flood, all presumably likely within weeks, and not more than months apart. Anything to do with the magnetic field reducing the rate of production of carbon-14 should be uniform across everything that died in the flood, and only start affecting organisms after the amount of atmospheric carbon-14 starts to appreciably increase in size, and then settle at a new higher equilibrium.
The rapid decay of the Earth's magnetic field is a globally tracked phenomenon going on for almost 200 years now.
For about that time, there has been a general decay in the overall strength of the dipole moment of the geomagnetic field, but we have a paleomagnetic record going back much farther than the period of time that humans have been directly measuring the geomagnetic field. It shows that, in fact, the current decline is one of many cycles of weakening, reversal, strengthening, and then back to weakening before another reversal. Scientists actually have a pretty good record of tens of millions of years worth of magnetic field reversals with attendant weakening and strengthening. Even if we were to compress this to fit into a young Earth timeline, it would not be the case that we could say that there is a general weakening trend in the strength of any component of the geomagnetic field.
And it indicates an exponential decay with a half-life of about 1,400 years.
I love the creationist tendency to take things that we know not to be constant, or even to have a general trend, and extrapolate the currently observed rate indefinitely into the past. They do this with things like the decay of biomolecules, the change in the strength of the Earth's magnetic field, the rate of coastal and other kinds of erosion, etc. But when it comes to things that we have every reason to think physically cannot be varied in any significant ways, like the rate of spontaneous decay of various unstable nuclides, the maximum deposition rate of shale or lime, etc., then suddenly we can just imagine any old changes to that rate, whatever is convenient at the time. Could it be more obvious how much they hate science?
So 1,400 years ago was twice as powerful. 2,800 years ago was 4 times as powerful. Get on back to the time before the flood, it was several times more powerful, and it does deflect cosmic rays, which is what produces carbon-14 by bombarding nitrogen-14 in the Earth's atmosphere.
Well, it's what produces atmospheric carbon-14, which is the source we're usually talking about when we talk about carbon dating. But remember, these fossils don't have any of the original carbon in them. which means that the source can't be directly from the atmosphere. So how did they get the carbon-14? Well, one way is that new carbon-14 can be created by the decay products of uranium interacting with boron-14 and oxygen-14 to create carbon-14. You see, fossils actually tend to concentrate environmental uranium, because for various reasons they tend to accumulate any uranium that enters the environment, whereas the surrounding matrix tends not to retain it. This means that on this basis alone, a permineralized fossil will often be radioactive, and also have carbon-14 that is being generated within the fossil. There are also a couple other sources of new carbon-14. One big one is that sometimes fossils are contaminated, whether by new biogenic material from recent bacteria, or even just from coal, which is where at least one of the Thomas samples was found. Further, new crystals can precipitate from dissolved minerals in water and then grow on or even in the fossils, and such minerals can be quite recent and contain carbon-14.
So at the time before the flood, less carbon-14 was being produced. So when animals died and were buried in the flood, they had less carbon-14 in them than animals that died today.
Which should result in a fairly uniform radiocarbon age for all flood fossils. But that's not what we find. It's amazing that since he is not beholden to evidence or even plausibility, he can just make up anything to explain this, and yet the thing he makes up doesn't explain it. He must be a very special kind of stupid.
Because the Earth's magnetic field isn't strong today, and therefore more production of carbon-14 takes place because more cosmic rays get through to cause that production.
It is true that a stronger magnetic field would deflect more cosmic rays and reduce the production of carbon-14.
So they assume that the current rate of carbon-14, which is about 1 trillion to 1 ratio of normal carbon-12 to carbon-14, that has been the same for millions of years.
Nope, that is not a claim or assumption that is made. First, since for most of the history of Earth the strength of the magnetic field is irrelevant since it was too long ago to matter to radiocarbon dating, we can just disregard that. But for the relevant parts, the paleomagnetic record is consulted, as are other methods of dating such as electron spin resonance, dendrochronology, and ice core dating. From this, a correction curve can be constructed that takes into account the variations in the amount of atmospheric carbon-14 through time. These corrections go into what's called a calibration curve. So let's see how this works at a basic level. If we do some math, we can get a formula to solve for the number of half-lives that involves some logarithmic shenanigans and whatnot. But anyway, that is the equation that can be used to solve for the age of the sample in the naive case that assumes constant modern levels of atmospheric radiocarbon. This number is then compared to the calibration curve to account for the long-term changes in atmospheric carbon concentration, and that is how the actual date is measured. Tom here hasn't discovered one neat trick scientists don't want you to know about. This is already well-known, publicly discussed, and accounted for in science.
And therefore, when they see less carbon-14 than what animals have that die today, they assume there's been some half-lives of decay.
It's not an assumption, it's checked. The work has been done and is being refined. This alleged problem isn't news to anyone working in carbon dating. Like all measurement techniques, it has known error margins and limitations. No one is pretending otherwise.
That's why these give measurable ages, but they measure, anywhere from 20 to 45,000 or so years.
Which again, wouldn't actually be explained by his proposed mechanism, since his mechanism would result in largely uniform ages. But the mechanisms of contamination, recrystallization of carbonaceous minerals, and the new production of carbon-14 from radioactive processes in the ground all result in variable amounts of carbon-14, which is probably why those are the actual explanations that scientists generally accept.
It's because they don't take into account the fact that these creatures had less carbon-14 in them when they died because of the stronger magnetic field at the time before the flood.
I've already gone over this. The fluctuations in the magnetic field are indeed taken into account.
But the big problem, the big problem is there shouldn't be any measurable carbon-14 at all.
Incorrect.
And we don't just find it in dinosaur bones, we find it in things even in the Cambrian, ancient wood and things like that.
Turns out that the known processes that can introduce younger carbon into fossils are going on today, regardless of how old the fossil is. I would expect that Cambrian fossils would also have some amount of carbon-14 detected. Of course, let's not also forget that creationists routinely actually do fail to find carbon-14 in fossils, getting dates back that are identical to when a control is used, and they just report those as real ages anyway. So Kendall is actually being somewhat more reasonable than most creationists are on this topic, and it still doesn't help him.
Now, here we have a radiocarbon in dinosaur bones at an international conference back in 2012 that was censored in the Philippines.
As it says on his slide, which is just a screen grab from creation.com, the meeting was in Singapore, which is its own country and not a part of the Philippines. Singapore is its own country. It's one I've been to. I even ate jellyfish and went to church there. Ultimately, this doesn't matter much, but it shows the overall pattern of just not caring if what is said is true.
And a term of German researchers gave a presentation at the 2012 Western Pacific Geophysics meeting in Singapore.
A talk that is still on YouTube as of the time of this writing, although the audio quality is atrocious. The presentation is allegedly by one Dr. Thomas Seiler, who seems to be a young Earth creationist associated with the Catholic Young Earth creationist organization, the Colby Center, who I've covered before. Most of the talk is just presenting charts that display data from his dating of various dinosaur fossils. Most show above background signals, which is not unexpected or particularly significant. He concludes that contamination is unlikely, which does not seem to have been just accepted, and also does not address all of the possibilities for his low but significant carbon-14 finds.
August 13 through 17, at which they gave carbon-14 dating results from many bone samples from 8 dinosaur specimens, and they took all the rigorous protocol to eliminate the possibility of contamination.
Well, they claim to have done so, but they did not actually present their full methods, so we can't actually say that they did so successfully. But they also did not even mention things like the creation of new carbon-14 from the decay of uranium and subsequent interactions with boron and oxygen nuclei. So even if we do accept their claim at face value, that only accounts for some of the potential sources of carbon-14, other than that it was intrinsic to the biological components of the dinosaur in question. Now, to be fair, it's a 16-minute presentation, and I wouldn't expect that in that time they would have time to go into every single detail, but as it is, the presentation isn't exactly stunning evidence of the young age of dinosaur bones. It's not even really anything new. It took place well after the Brian Thomas source Kindell used before, as well as well after various responses, including one article by Philip Center about this, which I have relied on in this video.
Which is the only main argument that they use.
Weird, because the first source I found for this from a non-creationist author had 2 other arguments, but okay.
It's been contaminated with Martin radiocarbon. They didn't really have that. When you rule out the possibility of contamination, they don't know what to say.
Well, that's just not true. I'm not even in this field, and I had something to say right away.
And so they resort to censorship.
They must be really bad at censorship, since I was able to watch the entire presentation within 5 minutes of learning that it existed, simply by finding the Creation.com article and following its link to the talk. I can't find any evidence of censorship, really. The CMI article says that it is not included on an archived version of the schedule. Of course, much of that archived schedule is missing. However, I'm not sure if that explains it. But this sent me down something of a rabbit hole. You see, the guy giving the talk, one Dr. Thomas Seiler, as I've said, doesn't seem to exist. Now, that's not to say that a man answering to that name did not give this presentation. I saw it happen in a video. The only 2 places I can find any mention of a Dr. Thomas Seiler in connection to anything to do with geology or evolutionary biology is in reference to this talk and one debate with a priest hosted by the Colby Center. The latter seems not to exist anymore, as any time I've tried to listen to it, the page has failed to load. But further, it seems that no one named Thomas Seiler has ever gotten a PhD anywhere. There are no papers with such a person as the author. The paper on which this talk was largely based has not been published anywhere that I can find, and further, it seems that multiple of the samples being talked about in the talk were from the collection of Carl Baugh. Now, am I saying that Carl Baugh made up a scientist, got some guy to pretend to be that guy, then that guy wormed his way into a science conference in Singapore to talk some nonsense to a small group of gathered scientists? Well, no, but also that's where all the signs seem to be pointing. So another much more likely scenario is that this talk was removed from the schedule after it was discovered that the speaker was lying about who he was and what his credentials were.
And so this was presented in the symposium. It was on the internet.
It still is on the internet.
And some of these people took it upon themselves to remove it permanently.
Yeah, knowing what I know now, that seems appropriate. I would expect that someone lying about who they were would be grounds for removing their talk, as would, honestly, any association with Carl Baugh that isn't antagonistic. Everything that guy touches turns out to be a fraud of some kind or another, generally academic and not financial or legal, although given what friend of the channel Chrissy Hansen has turned up about him, I wouldn't rule out the other 2 either.
Without even asking the presenters or asking even the sponsors of the symposium.
What evidence is there that neither the sponsors nor the speaker were contacted? I haven't seen evidence that they were, but that's not the same as evidence that they were not. Right now, I don't know if they were contacted, and I have formed no belief on the matter. Kindell should do the same, or present the evidence he must have seen to convince him that they were not contacted.
They took it upon themselves as judge, jury, and executioner to get rid of it. That tells me this is powerful evidence.
And it tells me that they probably felt betrayed by someone violating the general rules about openness and honesty that are core to the scientific endeavor. Remember, when people are either not open or not honest, we get debacles like cold fusion and Archaeoraptor. So while I don't really know what happened in this instance, the preponderance of the evidence leans towards this being a creationist fraud, more than it does towards some scared biologist or geologist censoring the amazing evidence of a young Earth, which has not since been published in the years since. And it's doubly on that side, since the evidence was just trust me bro, there was no contamination, and no attempt to rule out other sources of carbon-14.
If they could debate it publicly and refute it, they would.
That's true.
And in fact they have. One of my sources is radiocarbon in dinosaur fossils compatibility with an age of millions of years, published in 2020 and written by Philip J. Center, a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences in Fayetteville State University in North Carolina. It is a direct refutation of these claims, not those of the man going by Dr. Seiler directly, but of the whole idea that radiocarbon in dinosaur fossils is a problem for science.
Because they figured they couldn't, the only other option is censorship, and that's exactly what they did.
It's almost like Kindell here has never actually searched the literature to see if this has been addressed. Isn't that odd?
So at the bottom here, the quote is what I'm looking at. At the top, we're talking about the buildup of carbon-14 in the atmosphere. That's another evidence for young age, but we're not specifically talking about that.
It's not evidence of a young age, because we have records of atmospheric carbon-14 in ice cores going back longer than Kindell thinks the Earth has been around, and it has more or less been at equilibrium for the whole time despite fluctuations. There is no sudden increase in radiation in the upper atmosphere, followed by a buildup from more or less no carbon-14 to current rates. The graph is not showing measurements, it's just a made-up curve that illustrates his fairy tale.
That is covered in my DVD, Scientific Evidence for Young Age of the Earth.
Oh, he hawks DVDs. They might actually work as something to fall asleep to, if nothing else. His voice is soothing, provided the audio quality is good, unlike here.
But at the bottom, I point out that every sample of coal, oil, wood, or bone that has been tested for carbon-14 content, even if retrieved from rocks supposedly millions of years old.
And in those cases, the bone and wood aren't even going to be bone or wood, so no original carbon from the organism will be present, meaning that this carbon-14 cannot be intrinsic, but okay.
Always contains a measurable amount of carbon-14.
That's not actually true. Those creationists routinely report findings of carbon-14 that are beyond the ability of test equipment to distinguish from background, meaning that they actually cannot say with any confidence that carbon-14 was found in those samples. Also, if he thinks carbon-14 concentrations were zero before the flood, then organisms that died almost at any point in the flood should have essentially no time to incorporate measurable amounts of carbon-14 into their bodies. And so all should read the maximum carbon-14 age, and only post-flood organisms should have any carbon-14 above background. Kindell's ideas here are logically inconsistent, meaning that really, they don't actually rise to the level of ideas.
And that should never be the case, but it is always the case, and it's because all of these creatures were buried at the time of the flood, just several thousands of years ago.
It is very strange to me that he can't even predict the actual test results if his idea were correct. His idea requires there to be C14 already in the atmosphere before the flood, and for there not to be, and for animals during the flood to incorporate wildly different amounts of carbon-14 into their biology through no known mechanism, since breathing and eating won't cut it in less than a year. There is just no there. This isn't an alternative explanation for the findings of carbon-14 in dinosaur fossils. This is just the fever dream of a very stupid man.
And they had less carbon-14 in them, but it's still there, because it's only been several thousand years, and not the 100,000 years or so that it takes for it to disappear.
Then we would get consistent dates, since all of these organisms in the fossil record died within a year of each other. We don't.
Another major problem is the discovery of desiccated, intact dinosaurs.
So on screen is the Brachylophosaurus canadensis specimen known as Leonardo, which is the permineralized remains of a mummified dinosaur. It preserved previously unknown soft tissue like a crop in the throat, much like that of birds, the keratinous beak, possibly a tongue, and gut contents.
Where their skin and their intestines and even the contents of their intestines are still intact.
Yep.
These aren't really fossilized, they simply dried out and mummified.
Wrong.
They are in fact permineralized. When you look at Leonardo, you are looking at a rock in the shape of the soft tissue. No part of Leonardo's body is known to be original to the animal itself.
And this has been found around the world, but one of the most exquisite cases was found up in Canada.
Actually, it's found almost never, almost nowhere, and the fact that both of his examples are North American late Cretaceous dinosaurs should probably be a hint that he's wrong that this happens all over the world. In fact, Leonardo and the Borealopelta mummy in the Royal Tyrrell Museum are basically the only two such finds ever made for a Mesozoic dinosaur.
Canada unveils a dinosaur mummy found with skin and gut contents intact.
Well, intact is a bit of an exaggeration for the skin. The skin is intact across the dorsal surface of the find, but the limbs and the ventral side are missing, meaning that, in fact, the skin is not intact. This is probably because the animal washed out to sea and fell to the bottom of a shallow sea upside down, since the dorsal side is more dense, what with being covered with bony armor plates. This means that the limbs and ventral surface were probably exposed for longer and thus were not preserved.
As it says in the upper right-hand corner there, since that lucky moment, it has taken researchers 7,000 hours over the course of the past 6 years to both test the remains and prepare them for display.
Paleontology is a lot of work.
At the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Canada, which I believe in Alberta, Canada. If you ever get up there, you might want to take a look at it in person.
Agreed, the Royal Tyrrell Museum is one of the coolest museums I've never managed to get to. In fact, I think I've only been to 2 museums in Canada, the Royal BC Museum in Victoria, British Columbia, and Le Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal in Montreal, Quebec. Both were great, and I recommend both, although my recommendation comes from not having been to either in well over a decade, so maybe they suck now. I doubt it, though.
Where visitors now have the chance to see the closest thing to a real-life dinosaur that the world has ever likely seen.
Well, that's silly. I can hardly go outside during the day and not see at least a dozen or so living dinosaurs. I'm really wondering what about this find is such a problem for science, though. Kindell seems not interested in telling us anything beyond that the find is cool, which is admittedly true.
Well, there it is, my friends. Intact bone, intact cartilage, intact proteins.
I cannot find any reports of any proteins, let alone intact proteins, in this fossil. Mass spectrometry was used to confirm the existence of preserved melanin, but melanin is not a protein. It is a particularly sturdy organic compound, but it is not a polymer of amino acids, which is what a protein is by definition. If Kindell has a report of protein recovery from this fossil, then he should probably cite it. As is, I have to conclude that this is yet another lie.
Skin intact, with melanin proteins intact, the guts.
Well, at least now we know that he's stupid and not just a liar on this. Melanin is not a protein. Finding it does not mean you found a protein. There's a fair chance that you watching this also did not know that melanin is not a protein, but that's okay. The difference is that you're not going around getting chemistry wrong in hopes of causing the downfall of the basis of modern society. Kindell is. I have higher standards for him, and yet he fails to live up to even the lower standards I would hold other people to who are not pretending to teach these things.
Dried out but intact, and we can tell what it ate for its last meal. That's intact.
Well, it is true that the melanin is pretty intact, as are the gut contents. It's just that that's not protein, nor is it inexplicable. Like, I really want to know what the argument is. Is it that some fossils are exceptionally well preserved, therefore a flood? I mean, no matter what caused fossils to form, there would always be a spectrum of level of preservation, and cherry-picking 2 of them that are at the high end of the spectrum doesn't seem to be an argument for or against the flood. All
of this should have degraded into the finest dust by thermodynamic breakdown and by radiation bombardment within at most a few 100,000 years.
Nope, melanin is incredibly robust and can last basically forever. And the rest of this is rock, not tissue. Rock can also basically last forever. Nothing in this find even counts as soft tissue preservation at the chemical level. There has been no recovery of proteins here, so even if we didn't have a good explanation for the chemical preservation of protein remnants like those that Dr. Schweitzer found, this fossil isn't an example of that anyway.
There should be nothing but the finest dust.
Rock can survive a very long time. This is made of rock.
Instead, we have this largely intact Ankylosaurus-type dinosaur.
Specifically, it is a nodosaurid ankylosaur. Nodosauridae is the sister group to Ankylosauridae, and the easiest way to tell them apart is that Ankylosaurids had tail clubs, and Nodosaurids do not.
Which they claim to be 110 million years old. Now in the world, did it survive thermodynamic breakdown and ground radiation bombardment for that time?
It didn't. It just got turned to stone, because this is a permineralized fossil with no soft tissue preservation beyond permineralization of some of the skin and keratin, which itself preserved one category of non-protein biomolecule that is already incredibly robust and about as long-lasting as the rock itself. The only reason to think that this couldn't last 110 million years is if you think rocks can't last that long. But there's no reason to think that.
Well, they have no idea. They just claim that we found a number of these, and isn't it amazing, that it doesn't refute evolution because we say so.
No one said that, because there's no reason to even suspect that this could refute evolution. Nothing about this is out of line with any known science, evolution included. It's just rare and cool, but that's it. Literally nothing here poses even as much of a challenge as Schweitzer's collagen remnants. Like, the only argument he's presented is that there are preserved proteins, which there are not. So what do we have left? Just a really well-preserved dinosaur.
Well, saying it doesn't make it so.
Boy, is that something Kindell should take on board himself.
Proof how it could survive thermodynamic breakdown and ground radiation breakdown, then maybe you could have some credibility. But just denying it and saying, well, other evolutionists say it can last that long doesn't prove it at all.
Okay, I'm skipping the rest of what he has to say about Borealopelta, since he's just fundamentally wrong about what melanin is, and that's his only argument. He just goes on to keep saying how it can't be so intact and how freshly dead it looks. We'll pick back up with him discussing radiometric dating more broadly.
Now, the evolutionists, those that are honest, realize that using a stage of evolution to build the geological column is using the assumption of evolution, therefore it's invalid due to circular reasoning.
And isn't how the stratigraphic column was or is constructed anyway, so hooray.
So they need an independent means of verifying the age of the rocks and the fossils.
Well, stratigraphy is independent, it's just relative. Radiometric dating is absolute, which is nice. Remember, relative dating just tells you which strata are older and younger than which other strata. But absolute dating, even if it's wrong, returns an age with a number and a unit of time, like 50 million years, plus or minus 3 million.
And they claim that radioisotope dating does that independently, but it is not true.
Big claim.
Because it's another form of circular reasoning, because only the assumptions that fit the pre-arranged geological timetable are allowed to be printed and accepted in the textbooks and in the research.
There are no untested assumptions in radiometric dating as a technique. Like, literally none. The only assumption that comes even close is that of induction, that we can use past experience to predict future experience. But that's like the bedrock of science. Without that, literally all of science falls apart because it becomes impossible to test hypotheses.
If radioisotope dating contradicted what they already agreed upon in the geological column, it simply would not be used.
But it already did that. Before radiometric dating, the general consensus in geology was that the Earth was probably not more than a few tens of millions of years old. Instead, radiometric dating showed that it was far, far older, and that was accepted despite overturning the general sedimentologically derived age. It's almost like Kindell never bothered to actually look into the history of things like geology, paleontology, biological evolution, thermodynamics, etc.
But it has so many assumptions. They call it absolute dating, which is an absolute crock.
All that means is that it gives you a measurement with a magnitude and a unit. It's not a crock, it might be inaccurate, even worthless, but it's still absolute.
It has many unverifiable assumptions which can be easily manipulated to make it fit whatever date they want, and they already know what date they want because they've already figured out the geological column.
Actually, no, it can't just be manipulated, whatever that means. But even if that were true, that wouldn't make it not an absolute dating method. I suspect Kindell doesn't actually know what absolute means in this context. I think he means that it's absolutely true, or absolutely reliable, which is not what it means at all. It contrasts, in this case, with relative.
Before radioisotope dating was ever even discovered.
Except that radiometric dating actually pushed back our estimates of the age of the Earth by about 2 orders of magnitude, because science actually is about following the evidence where it leads, and before radiometric dating, there wasn't really a reason to think it led to billions of years. But when radiometric dating showed that actually some rocks on Earth are billions of years old, geologists ended up taking that on board and applying such ages to previously established but incorrectly dated strata. And by incorrectly dated, I mean in terms of the estimates as to their absolute age. The relative ages of the strata were well confirmed, since they were based on the so far basically unchallenged laws of stratigraphy laid down by Steno, as previously discussed.
So they already have their theory, they already have the order of the fossils, they already have the general dates of the ages.
Nope, only the first 2.
Radioisotope dating is just window dressing for public relations.
This man has a copium line going directly into his bloodstream. He is mainlining cope. And of course, even if he were right, guess what? That would just be a successful prediction by scientists about the age of the Earth. So he's wrong, but even if he were right, then far from that being bad, it would be, if anything, evidence that geologists in the past were better at their jobs than they had any right to be. When a new technique comes by and confirms your predictions, that's a W. If he wants to frame it as an L, well, that's a weird choice.
To make it look like they're not using circular reasoning, when in fact they still are, because the theory of evolution still takes precedent over radioisotope dating, in so much as radioisotope dating is never now allowed to contradict what they already agreed on about the age.
Nope. There is no checkbox or blank on a form for how old you want a sample to be. Nor does it have anything to do with evolution, except that it doesn't contradict evolution, because, spoiler, both the ancient age of the Earth and evolution are true. Basically, he's just not happy that independent lines of evidence about the past all converge on about the same answer, and that it's an answer he just doesn't like and wants to reject. Well, tough shit. This convergence isn't a conspiracy, and by proposing one, he now has to actually show evidence for the conspiracy. But since this isn't the first time he's proposed a conspiracy in science, and he has yet to ever show any evidence for any conspiracy, we can just ignore the conspiracy claim until he does show evidence, which we all know he won't.
But it has three major assumptions. One is a constant decay rate, which has turned out to be strong evidence against that.
The strong evidence against that amounts to wishful thinking by creationists and nothing more. In reality, varying the rate at which various nuclides undergo spontaneous nuclear decay requires changing fundamental forces of nature, like the strong and weak nuclear forces. It is physically impossible to do. These rates are unaffected by physical circumstances except for going at relativistic speeds, which would only slow down the observed rate. There is no way to increase that rate that is even conceivable within physics as we understand it. Now, induced decay from things like beta or neutron capture can indeed be sped up by increasing the flux of the particle that is interacting with the nuclei in question. But radiometric dating does not use induced decay processes for this very reason.
No loss or gain of the parent or daughter isotopes. In other words, no contamination or leaching taking place.
Depending on technique, that is in fact impossible, or checked for. In many cases, like uranium lead testing in zircons, lead is chemically excluded and the crystals are so hard and long-lasting that we can know that there was no significant change in these. And further techniques, like isochron dating, can check for such leaching into or out of the rock directly, and even further, rocks that have had events happen to them that can cause such leaching, as a rule, have metamorphosed in detectable ways, and so are not suitable candidates for radiometric dating in the first place.
To disrupt those ratios and the known amounts of daughter product present at the start.
Again, that is often known and can be checked on. For example, if you're looking for argon as a daughter, well, argon doesn't really form chemical bonds, so it isn't incorporated into crystals as they form. So in many cases, we don't need to check on this unless Kendall is going to propose that in addition to changing the strong and weak nuclear forces that control spontaneous decay, that there were also changes to how the electromagnetic force which governs chemistry works. And at that point, you're just changing most of the fundamental forces of the universe. Can you really say that what you're proposing is scientific and not just, well, magic? I don't think so. I think proposing, what if physics was just different one day, is proposing magic.
Now, the problem is, this is kind of like, in a rough analogy, using an hourglass to measure time. When you turn the hourglass over, it starts with all the sand in the top chamber. Then, at a measured rate, it filters down to the bottom.
Hey, Tom knows how hourglasses work. I'm sure Lord Inquisitor Torquemada Cotiaz of the Ordo Malleus of the Emperor's Most Holy Inquisition would be proud.
Brother, get the flamer. The heavy flamer.
As it does, the amount in the top decreases, and simultaneously, the amount of sand in the bottom increases. And by measuring the changing of these ratios in the top and the bottom chambers over time, you can tell how much time has passed, provided that everything stays in a closed system.
That's true.
In other words, if you had wind blowing sand into the top and into the bottom, or out of the top and out of the bottom, changing the ratio, then it wouldn't be an accurate clock. Or if the aperture that allows the sand through got bigger or smaller allowing more sand at one time and less at another, then it would be a variable change rate.
This dude needs to make a point. So far, all of this has just been, if things are different, they would be different. Not exactly the most groundbreaking discovery.
In the hourglass, you have basically,
I'll excuse the bodily functions, not the intellectual dishonesty.
Basically a perfect closed system, which is not realistic. In the real world, groundwater penetrating through rocks can radically disrupt the ratios of parent and daughter isotopes.
If only the minerals in question are actually amenable to chemical alteration from water. Some are, some aren't. These things aren't new to geologists. They're aware of all of this. As a tip, if you, as a non-expert in a field, think you have discovered some single simple thing that will radically shake up or overturn an entire field of study that none of the experts have thought of, chances are that you're wrong. They know about it, and they have already accounted for it, and you're a little more than an annoying gnat to people who study whatever the topic is for a living.
To the effect of changing the apparent age by millions of years, even billions of years. So,
yes, it is true that if you simply ignore chemistry and physics, you can come up with reasons why radiometric dating would be consistently wrong by 5 to 7 orders of magnitude. But that's a stupid thing to do.
They really don't mind. They like having a lot of assumptions that they can easily manipulate.
That's weird because as far as I can tell, there aren't any such assumptions in radiometric dating. You can't just manipulate the assumption that physics is what it is, which is really the main assumption of radiometric dating.
If they run the equation and they get ages too young and too old to what they want, they could say, well, there was some contamination, there was some leaching.
You might not have noticed, but what he did right there was admit that radiometric dating actually doesn't always return the expected age, but earlier he was saying that so-called assumptions are manipulated to get the right age. So why accept that a wrong age was returned by the test at all? Oh right, because there is, in fact, no conspiracy, and scientists acknowledging the limits of their measurement techniques isn't a reason to doubt the validity of the science, but quite the contrary is a reason to accept it.
These few ages that fit what they're supposed to be, those must be accurate though. So we're going to publish those.
Anomalous ages are in fact published all the time, along with proposed reasons for the anomaly. And there are even whole papers about discovering why some dates are anomalous, what caused it, how to work around whatever problems there are, etc. And further, what Kindell is suggesting is widespread systematic bias in dates that are published. That's something we can test for statistically. It's weird that no creationists who propose this conspiracy among geologists have ever bothered to present statistical evidence for any such bias. But that's because there is no such bias.
And if none of them fit, we'll assume that some of these variables caused it to be off, so we'll recalibrate the assumptions to make it fit. So with a calculation where nobody knows the real values, you can't prove it scientifically. You can put whatever you want in that equation and force it to give you whatever date you want.
Then Kindell should do that. He should get a sample, measure their isotopic ratios, and then show how he can get any possible age out of it without invoking any magic. Like, how does one propose to account for the inability of certain decay products to be chemically included in various crystals? How does he plan to deal with the fact that isochron dating means that the initial parent-to-daughter ratios are actually irrelevant in samples that can be isochron dated? How does he plan to deal with the fact that we have corroborated measured radiometric ages with historically documented volcanic events such as the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum? How will he account for the fact that rocks from the same stratigraphic position, found in vastly different parts of the world, give corresponding radiometric ages? Of course, we know he just won't do any of this. He'll just keep whining without ever putting forth even a source, never mind evidence that he's right. Remember, this isn't fundamentally about being correct. It's about getting a certain type of Christian to just kind of stop thinking about this and continue being that kind of Christian.
And of course, it always fits with evolution, so it is, again, circular reasoning.
When two independent lines of evidence converge on the same answer, that's called corroboration, not circular reasoning.
Now, to test this out, they took samples of the lava dome of Mount St. Helens, the one that actually formed in 1986.
Who did? Steve Austin? Because I'm kind of tired of addressing Steve Austin's bullshit.
And they got permits to take samples of this, I believe, in 1987. So it was about 10, 11 years at the most from the time the rocks actually formed. One of their major assumptions is that when the magma breaches the surface of the Earth and becomes a lava flow, that when it reaches the surface of the Earth, it allows these daughter isotopes to actually evaporate out.
That's like saying they make the assumption that when you pass enough electrical current through water, it creates oxygen and hydrogen gas. That's not an assumption, that's just plain old experimentally verified chemistry. Unless he has new chemistry he'd like to put forward, then that's just how it is.
So by the time the rock cools, you don't have the daughter isotopes, you have only the parent.
That depends on which daughter isotopes we're talking about and what rock we're talking about. There is no perfect one-size-fits-all radiometric technique that is appropriate in all circumstances.
So it's like setting the clock to zero. It's like turning the hourglass over, and you only have the parent that then gradually turns into the daughter.
In point of fact, in many cases, some amount of daughter material is expected, and we can measure freshly cooled rocks to see that. That's why we have things like isochron dating, which takes into account multiple parent-to-daughter pairs, their decay rates, and it is able to cancel out starting parent-to-daughter ratios, specifically because in some cases, we don't have good reason to think that little to no daughter isotope would be present in the rock when it first cooled. Everything he has to say about this is just stuff scientists are already well aware of and have already accounted for. It's like he's going into a 5-star restaurant's kitchen and reminding everyone working there how important salt is.
Now, the proof that that was a faulty assumption was they tested this lava dome that formed from lava that extruded up the top Mount St. Helens, and it dated anywhere from a few 100,000 years to nearly 3 million years.
And depending on which technique you use, that might be correct. All measurement techniques come with a margin of error, and you can't call a measurement wrong unless you have good reason to think that the true magnitude of the value you're trying to measure lies outside the measured value plus or minus the error margin. For example, if you wanted to radiometrically date a 10-year-old volcanic rock, and the measurement you got back was 3 million years old plus or minus 4 million years old, then really, what the measurement is saying is that the rock is less than 7 million years old, which in this case is correct. Also, some measurements have a minimum value, below which they cannot reliably go. One such technique is the one used by Steve Austin, a young Earth creationist of ill repute, as if there were other kinds of repute among them, who sent off samples which suspiciously look like what Kindell is talking about, to a lab that openly stated they could not date rocks so young, and then he got back dates, all but one of which were consistent with rocks of essentially zero age that couldn't be measured. Real science isn't so simple as looking at a calendar, then noting that the date you get that way and the date that you get through counting atoms doesn't exactly match, and then declaring that really, it was all magic in the first place. That's how Kindell would like it to be, I'm sure, but that's not how anyone who cares about science would like it to be, and that's not how it is.
For a rock we know formed historically, observationally, only about 11 years previously. It should have given an age too young to even measure.
If this is the study that I'm thinking about, then that is what came back. Ages that all indicated that a rock was too young to measure given the machines that were used for the analysis.
Instead, it measured in the hundreds of thousands to millions of years.
Which for some techniques is essentially zero. It might sound like a lot of error, but when a technique is designed to detect ages in the hundreds of millions of years, an error of a few 100,000 or even a few million years is pretty minuscule.
That destroys their theory. Their methodology is fundamentally flawed.
That's some serious wishful thinking.
And it's not just in an isolated case like this. In the book, The Young Earth by Dr. John Morris.
John D. Morse is the son and successor to Henry Morse, the founder of the Institute for Creation Research, now headed up by Randy Galuza, whom I've also covered more than once here. Also, I love that the citation here is just icr.org, as if that were enough, and as if that isn't a giant webpage full of bullshit to wade through in hopes of getting this one little chart. Also, who did the typography on this? The mixing of fonts and colors is eye-searingly ugly. I hate virtually everything about this.
Who I believe may still be the president of the Institute for Creation Research. He took over after his father, Henry Morris. But I don't know if he's retired or not. But
he is in fact dead. He died in 2023. I don't know exactly when Kindell gave this talk, though, so I can't really fault him for not being a time traveler.
Anyway, he was the author of this book, and in a CD-ROM included with it, it had all this data on recent lava flows that were known of historically to be rather recent, and yet when they measured them, they gave ages of hundreds of thousands to millions of years. In fact, of course, they should not have.
So the source is a CD-ROM from a book that ICR sold who knows when from years ago. Who measured these? Where? With what techniques? Who knows? Did they even really get these results? We don't know. But what I can tell you is that in 2007, Marvin Lanfer, Dwayne Champion, Leon Meluso, and Vincenzo Mora reported in the Bulletin of Volcanology on their argon-argon dating of the pumice from Mount Vesuvius' AD 79 eruption, and got the right date, 1,925 years old plus or minus 66 years as of 2004. That means that the measured date was literally AD 79, with the earliest date being AD 13 and the latest date being AD 145. See how I did that? I told you who did it, what they did, what the result was, when they did it, and where to find it. That's called citing a source. It's something creationists seem largely incapable of doing. But also, he goes on like this for quite a while, just saying that creationists got unusual results, not citing sources, and then just asserting that because some of the most notoriously dishonest people to ever pretend to do geology may be reported incongruous dates from who knows what they did, that therefore science is actually fake. It's not a real argument, and I'm done responding to it.
Now, the RATE project, done by the Institute for Creation Research over an 8-year period,
who rather hilariously concluded that the evidence was in line with radiometric dating and that their flood model was physically impossible, but then who decided to celebrate their great success anyway. RATE is probably my favorite young Earth creationist punching bag because it was such a huge self-own.
RATE as acronym stands for radioisotopes in the age of the Earth.
A very sloppy acronym.
And they documented in there that the production of helium as a byproduct of radioisotope decay, alpha decay.
As a quick reminder, alpha particles are in fact just helium nuclei, so anything that decays by the emission of alphas is in fact generating helium. This part is in fact accurate, and I just wanted to clarify.
Indicates that radioisotope decay must have been orders of magnitude faster in the past than what is measured today.
So Kindell doesn't really explain this much, meaning that I suppose I should. This argument is the brainchild of one Russell Humphreys. The argument is basically that he measured the rate at which helium diffuses from zircon crystals with a biotite shell with heating experiments. The measured rate of diffusion was high enough that if zircons were the ages that they are often measured to be, often billions of years old, the helium that was produced in them from alpha particle release should be mostly gone, having diffused through the crystals making up the sampled zircons. The way this works is that helium is both electrically neutral and just physically very small, meaning that it cannot be chemically bound in the crystal, and so only mechanical barriers to its escape exist. And being small, these mechanical barriers are weak, resulting in a fairly high rate of diffusion. They actually came up with 2 different models for this diffusion, both of which may have been designed to account for the data set that they had, but which so far have not been very successful at future predictions, or more specific predictions about helium concentrations in various parts of the crystals. But let's get a little bit more from Kindell.
If it was faster in the past, that means these large amounts that we find in the rocks are insignificant. If they got there rapidly, then a large amount does not equate to billions of years or millions of years of time.
Yep, this whole argument is to set up a mismatch between the evident amount of decay in the zircons versus the time such decay must have happened in. The argument is that if the decay happened rapidly, then the zircon should have relatively abundant helium, and if it did not, then it should be depleted in helium. Since according to Humphreys, the zircons have the amount of helium he might predict for a young Earth, this is evidence of accelerated nuclear decay, and therefore the young Earth. The thing is, though, that the model didn't actually predict any new data, it just fit the old data, which is all well and good, but subsequent testing by Gary H. Lochelt to see if their model can predict in more detail things like surface concentration of helium, which by the rate model should be abundant, has failed to support the young Earth creationist model. Instead, the testing resulted in concentrations more similar to his 2-state model, in which helium exists in both loosely bound and tightly bound states, such that heating experiments will mostly release loosely bound helium at a relatively rapid rate, but that tightly bound helium is lost at a much lower rate. But when the crystal is ground up for mass spectrometry, there is no way to tell the difference between the kinds of helium. The test he did for surface region helium is based on this idea. If all the helium has the same rate of diffusion out of the crystal, then there should be no relative abundance or depletion at different parts of the zircon. However, if he is correct, then the areas of the zircon near the surface should be relatively depleted compared to areas in the inner parts of the zircon. He found results that matched his prediction. So in addition to accelerated nuclear decay being physically impossible, the experiments purported to show that it must have happened anyway don't really indicate that.
To use an analogy, if you jack up your car and while it's still warm, the engine is warm, and you want to drain the oil, you pull the drain plug and let it drain into the pan. At first, that hot oil flows out practically like water, and you drain 6 quarts. Most of it drains in less than a minute. Then it starts dripping, and then it starts dripping real slow.
Unless this analogy is just about the rate of diffusion going up as heat goes up, which is true, I'm not sure what he's getting at. And if that is all this is, it hardly needed an analogy, but whatever. Of course, the fact is that the variability of the rate of diffusion of helium from zircon as a function of temperature does not make the concentration of helium in zircons more or less useless as a dating mechanism, because unlike spontaneous decay, it can be dramatically influenced by things like the thermal history of the zircon crystal. Once again, creationists love to use things with a variable rate as if they didn't, and things with a fixed rate as if they were variable. Creationism really is an inversion of science right to the core of being conclusion first, evidence second, if at all. It's like they took science, multiplied it by -1, and then just tried to pretend they hadn't.
If somebody comes around the corner and says, "Hey, Tom, what are you doing there?" "Oh, I'm changing my oil." I say, "How much oil you got in that bucket?" "Nah, about 6 quarts. "Wow, it's dripping so slow, it must have taken you days to accumulate that much oil." I said, "Well, no, you made an assumption. You assumed it always was at this slow rate. In fact, it was very fast at the beginning, and most of that got there in less than a minute, not days."
Well, it's worse than I thought. The oil was an analogy for the nuclides that decayed to make the helium, it seems, not the helium itself. The big difference, of course, being that the viscosity of oil is in fact hugely affected by temperature, whereas spontaneous nuclear decay is not until the thermal energy exceeds the binding energy of the nuclei, which doesn't happen until like quintillions Kelvin, a temperature not reachable on Earth, and one so hot that we're approaching the level where the Earth would just have long ago exploded, leaving Noah in a bit of a predicament, since wooden boats might work for a flood, but they tend not to work when the Death Star shows up to blow your whole planet up, which is the kind of heat that would be needed to even potentially cause heat to change decay rates. And it wouldn't change them by accelerating the rates anyway. It would just single-handedly destroy the nuclei, basically causing them to fission into a bunch of dissociated protons and neutrons. But even then, this is all speculative, because we can't actually do physics at these kinds of energy levels. There just is no mechanism to make spontaneous nuclear decay speed up, but keep the same decay chains. No one has proposed such a mechanism, not even the rate team who concluded that they needed exotic physics, which is just code for them not having a way within understood physics for their ideas to even be possible. Never mind plausible or probable.
So if you have a lot of oil, it does not equate to a long time if it got there fast. Same with the radioisotopes. If you have a lot of daughter product, but it got there by fast decay, it does not equate to millions of years, even though it is in the rocks.
Sure, and once someone finds a mechanism for speeding up nuclear decay, overcomes the problem that we actually have not enough helium for accelerated decay, not too much, and then figures out where all the heat would go, since even if heat isn't the cause of the accelerated decay, the decay itself would, by the rate team's own admission, release enough heat to vaporize the crust of the Earth several times over, then we can talk. So far we're at step -1. Step 0 would be acknowledgement that these are real problems that need to be worked on. We're still getting creationists to that point. Although, to their credit, at least some of them have figured this out and are at step 0. Step 1 is formulating some hypothesis that is testable that could solve any of these problems. Step 2 would be actually testing it. And let's remember that when you're trying to overturn the universal scientific consensus, the onus is on you as the rebel. So this is not something real scientists need to do. This is something that charlatans need to do to convince the scientific community that they are not, in fact, charlatans.
Now, in this radioisotope in the Age of the Earth project, they documented that uranium-238, when it decays, it goes through various decay products.
Well, they may have documented that, but they certainly weren't the first ones to do that. The decay chain of all isotopes of uranium is well known and has been for many decades.
Until it ends in the stable daughter product of lead-206. 8 times during the decay chain, it throws out alpha particles. Now, an alpha particle is chemically identical to the nucleus of a helium-4 gas atom.
It's not just chemically identical, it's identical in every way, because it is a helium-4 nucleus.
In other words, it has 2 protons and 2 neutrons.
That's true.
When it's thrown out, it picks up donor electrons from the environment and becomes full-blown helium-4 gas. So the upshot is you can't have this type of alpha radioisotope decay taking place without, as of necessity by chemical law, producing a large byproduct of helium gas.
Yes, but this is undisputed. So what's the real argument here?
The problem is that the gas leaks out of rocks. At the atomic level, rocks aren't all that solid. They're full of all kinds of cracks and fissures. And helium has only got 2 protons. It's the second smallest element to hydrogen, which only has 1 proton. So it's incredibly small. It's a light gas, so it likes to work its way up through the rocks to the surface of the Earth, into the atmosphere, and ultimately does escape into outer space.
In fact, right now, humans are using helium at a rate that will probably deplete the Earth's reserves in not that long. Like, we could be facing helium price surges in decades. And yeah, part of the problem is that helium likes to escape into space because it's so light that it can easily get enough kinetic energy to reach Earth's escape velocity.
So if this was being produced by slow radioactive decay, you would also have this commensurate amount of helium gas produced as well. And what they found was, if we have instruments now apparently accurate enough to count the number of lead-206 atoms, you multiply that times 8, that tells you exactly how many helium gas atoms were produced, so we can keep track of them. How fast have they been leaking? How far have they gotten? And what they have found is truly amazing, that this will leak through the rock matrix at the atomic level. It can't be held down. Helium is a noble gas, which means it's kind of like Teflon. It doesn't want to chemically bond or stick to anything, so it just goes right through these rocks, doesn't get bonded with anything. Leaks out of the zircon crystals, which are the primary crystals that hold the uranium and thorium atoms that decay and give off the helium. And it's leaking at such a rate that at the surface of the rocks is leaking out of the Earth's surface at an average rate of about 13 million helium atoms per square inch per second.
I mean, so far he's not really wrong. It's just this isn't going to help him, because the assumption he's making, but not really stating, is that all helium will escape at about the same rate because all helium has about the same opportunity to escape with the zircon. This is clearly not true. Think of the zircon like a mesh sieve, and the helium like flour. The mesh is fine, but not so fine that the individual grains of flour can't escape, and so you use it to get fine powdery flour with no lumps into whatever you're cooking. You can calculate a fairly reliable age of flour escape through the sieve with a given intensity of shaking of the sieve. But let's say that behind your back I have come and put superglue in some parts of the mesh, which has now cured, forming parts of the mesh that allow no or far fewer bits of flour through. You can still get a decent estimate for how much flour should escape per unit time with consistent shaking of the sieve. But when you're done getting the flour out by just shaking the sieve, you'll find that in areas with the superglue that is now cured, some extra flour will be left behind. And so while you might normally expect to find no flour after sifting flour until it stops coming out, now you actually find a measurable remaining amount you were not expecting. That's basically what is happening with the helium. Some of the helium has easier access to escape, some of it is more effectively trapped and has fewer large enough gaps to escape through, which means that you will tend to find more helium than a naive calculation with a diffusion rate would tend to predict.
Of course, if it's been leaking at that relatively fast rate, then there shouldn't be a lot of helium byproduct left over in the vicinity, but there is. We find it still trapped in the original zircon crystals, and that simply should not be the case.
It should be given a more sophisticated model, which has in fact been supported against the naive model Humphreys went with in his experiment. The ball is in the creationist court. Let's see if they serve.
What's shown here on the left is that the uranium decay clock they claim was so slow that to produce those amount of lead-206 atoms at the bottom there took about 1.5 billion years.
Pretty normal for a zircon to be that old.
But it's joined like a Siamese twin to this helium clock that also tells us something about what went on there. And what it tells us is that it must have been much faster because
the correct thing to do when you have seemingly contradictory data, and one set comes from something that is known to be basically unable to vary, and the other is from something that is known to be able to vary wildly, what you should do is assume that the invariant process varied and that the variable process did not. That makes lots of sense.
The helium, if it was being slowly produced over hundreds of millions of years until you get to 1.5 billion years, it would have had plenty of time to leak out of the zircon crystal, out of the rock matrix of the crust of the Earth, into the atmosphere, even into space. There should be hardly any radiogenic helium in the crust of the Earth if it had that much time to leak at the rate at which it leaks.
Yeah, if all the helium had the same rate of leakage, but we have good reason to say it did not. Now, I won't say that we know it won't, because frankly, not many people care. Humphreys is a nobody screaming into the void with a few other nobodies, who is making no advancements in science, is largely not even trying to get his work peer-reviewed, and who is pushing for a view of science that, if accepted, would effectively end the scientific enterprise as a whole, and all in favor of ideas that were already shown to be false centuries ago. So, as a result, as far as I can tell, only the aforementioned Gary H. Lochelt is even bothering to respond to this, although unsurprisingly, when he attempted to publish this in a creationist so-called journal, they dicked around for a year requesting infinite revisions. Because let's remember, you can't publish in creationist publications if you don't toe the line, even if the line is easily demonstrably wrong. But this does not mean that I don't have a good reason to think that anyone, Humphreys included, has a robust and well-supported model of helium diffusions from zircon. But I will say that Lochelt's hypothesis at least has going for it that it is so far a better match for the data, and doesn't involve physically impossible things like accelerated nuclear decay.
And so we would find that it should have leaked out. There should be very little there. Yet when we look at these clocks, we find an amazing thing.
To be a clock, it must have an invariant rate. Helium diffusion does not. It's not a clock.
The amount of helium still trapped in the zircon crystal is still at the majority level.
I'm assuming what he means by that is that the level of helium is above half of what we would expect given the evident amount of decay that would produce alpha particles.
Less than half of it has leaked out.
Yep, but that's not usually expressed by majority level. It's stuff like this that clues you in that Kindell doesn't really do much actual reading of scientific literature. Not even at a lay level, never mind technical papers.
At the rate that it is leaking, it appears to have only been leaking for about 6,000 years, plus or minus 2,000 years.
So, I haven't really wanted to say it, because for some reason I'm trying to be cordial and polite right now. But, that correspondence was almost certainly p-hacked. In other words, the rate team knew they needed 6,000 years, they had data, and they just came up with a model that both fit the existing data and provided a date of about 6,000 years ago for how long the helium has been escaping. The fact that it did not successfully predict new data is itself a confirmation of this. Now, I can't say for certain it was p-hacked, as I wasn't there when they were deriving their model from their data and conclusion. But let's just say that the coincidences are pretty suspicious, and I don't think they're coincidences at all. But hey, that's just my opinion.
So if even 15,000 years had passed, it should have all leaked completely out of the original host zircon crystals. But it hasn't even done that. The majority is still there.
Shame about those experimental results, though.
That means that radioisotope decay must have produced this byproduct so rapidly and so recently, it hasn't had time to leak out of the original crystals yet, even though it's leaking at a relatively rapid rate.
Okay, he's now just repeating himself. I'm not going to subject you to that.
The evolutionists say, yeah, but rapid radioactive isotope decay would produce too much heat.
So let me be clear.
It was also the rate team who said that, and who said that they did not have a solution to the problem.
And that would be a big problem, and we have no model that can, explain rapid radioisotope decay.
Yep, whereas there is a model that can explain helium retention in zircons.
Well, with the standard model of the atom, we don't that well, but there is another competing model for the structure of the atom.
Ooh, I didn't know the creationists had their own atomic model. This will be very interesting, especially since the model scientists use is quite robust and based on well-established physics.
It's known as the Lucas-Bergman model.
Based on what I can find, this model treats electrons as rings rather than as point-like. I don't see how that could possibly be the key to accelerating nuclear decay, since spontaneous nuclear decay is governed by the nuclear forces, not the electromagnetic force that keeps electrons doing their thing in the context of atoms. Maybe I'm looking at the wrong model, though.
Yeah, it's a relatively recent model. It was developed, I believe, in the 1980s. But nobody's actually disproved that model. It's just the standard model has gotten entrenched in the scientific mind.
Yeah, on looking more into this, it seems to be both a model that is not parsimonious and that will not help Kindell in the least. I would love to know what about treating charged particles as rings would mean that spontaneous nuclear decay can just decide to speed up one day. If anyone has any ideas, please let me know in the comments. But also, we have done a lot of particle accelerator experiments, and they have all been consistent with point-like fundamental particles. So there's also experimental evidence that the Lucas-Bergman model is just wrong.
It's been around nearly 100 years. It works well enough that, works well enough. If it works, don't bother with it.
When he says it works well enough, what he means is that it is the basis for electronics, chemistry, nuclear physics, computing, nuclear power generation, radiomedicine, etc. It works well enough that we base a huge swath of important technology on that model, and the technology works reliably and in ways that would be incredible just a few generations of humans ago. This is like saying, well, Einstein works well enough, all while we use his theories to get GPS going, to predict orbits, and to fly through space. It's hard to imagine how it could work any better.
But the proponents of the Lucas-Bergman model say that their model is superior.
Well, yeah, otherwise they probably wouldn't be proponents of it. But also, after doing some searching, I can't find anyone who fits that description besides Lucas himself. So it seems like those proponents aren't exactly a big population. Not that it's a popularity contest, but the fact that they've made no progress in shifting the scientific consensus in like 40 years means that the field just isn't impressed.
That it can explain things the standard model can't. It makes predictions that the standard model doesn't make, which hold out to be true.
Such as? Oh wait, this is Thomas Kindell, the man who's deathly allergic to giving examples of his wild and preposterous claims.
But perhaps most significantly of all, it not only allows for but predicts rapid initial radioisotope decay, and then slow decay thereafter.
It actually doesn't. It just predicts, according to Lucas at least, in a Microsoft Word document that he self-published, that it can account for the time dilation effects of relativity without needing relativity to be real. So in fact, this model is not just an attempt at a new model of particle physics, but also an attempted refutation of special relativity, which is a damn tall order, absurd on its face, and still doesn't help young Earthers. I must say, it's not often that in defense of absurdity, a pseudoscience peddler will appeal to an even more absurd pseudoscience that wouldn't even help him if it were real. Also interestingly, Lucas thinks that the model has solved the so-called problem that electrons do not shed radiation as they orbit. Of course, orbitals aren't orbits, and the electron doesn't actually circle a nucleus, so this is a fake problem that is being solved.
And it predicts that it can happen without having excessive heat.
No, the heat is unavoidable. Decay literally is the emission of particles. Those particles cannot be emitted without carrying energy with them. That energy will start out as kinetic, but through interactions with other particles, it will end up as thermal energy. There simply is no model that can overcome this. This is basic conservation of energy stuff here. We're talking about the first law of thermodynamics. If the Lucas-Bergman model actually did predict that the first law of thermodynamics was just silly nonsense, that on its own would be good reason to reject it, since the laws of thermodynamics are some of the most well-tested laws in all of physics. Now, as near as I can tell, it does no such thing, so that's good for the Lucas-Bergman model, but it also means that there's no help for Kindell. Also, I would note that if he thinks that this is so promising, rather than telling the internet about it, Kindell should approach the RATE team and show them what little on this model exists, and I mean little. I've been looking around and have found little more than a Word document that describes the model in any detail. This idea is obscure far beyond the normal obscurity that I deal with when it comes to young Earth creationism. Also, I suspect that Lucas would not agree with Kindell about most of this, but I can't say for sure, really.
Which is something that we also have evidence for in the rocks. We have radio halos produced by alpha radiation that produces damage in the rocks. And when you cut a cross-section to it, it looks like concentric circles of damage. But we have all these radioisotope halos indicating a lot of decay produced, but it didn't produce enough heat to melt the rocks.
Yes, which is evidence that there never was accelerated decay. The heat is required by the first law of thermodynamics, so if accelerated decay happened, there was heat. There is no other option. If we see no evidence of heat, then there was no accelerated decay. Full stop.
Because if the rocks melted, it would erase the evidence of the radioisotope rings, the radio halos.
Well, it doesn't have to fully melt, it just has to metamorphose a bit. The temperature at which things like these halos, as well as fission tracks, would be erased is called the annealing temperature. Basically, it's the temperature at which the crystal structure of the rock can kind of reset and erase these disruptions to it. If a rock still has such marks, it means that it has never reached the annealing temperature since these things were formed, giving us a vague idea of the rock's thermal history. And the fact that many rocks have extensive such signs of decay means that the rocks were never hot enough to account for that much decay in the span of just over a year. Because again, you can't get decay without heat. That's a violation of the first law of thermodynamics. That kinetic energy would have to simply be deleted from the universe for this to work. That's not how it works. Energy is conserved. If you start with potential energy in the nucleus, that is being carried away as kinetic energy by the radiation, and the only place for that energy to go is to turn into thermal energy in the rock system as a whole. Pretending that electrons are rings isn't going to change that.
So we have evidence of rapid decay.
No, we don't.
We have evidence that radioisotope decay can take place without melting the rocks, without producing excessive heat.
Well, yes, but that requires it to take place over hundreds of millions to billions of years.
And we have at least a theoretical model of the atom that would both explain and predict that.
No, we don't. Not even near as I can tell, according to the guys who created the model. And the proponents of this model don't even understand the model they think they're trying to replace.
So I think we need to do further research on this, but we do at least have the smoking gun.
I would love to see creationists doing research on donut electrons. Also, I would love an explanation as to how ring-shaped quarks somehow mean that the strong and weak forces don't act the way that we know they do from experiment. That would be needed for accelerated nuclear decay. It's fun that Kindle didn't even attempt an explanation of that.
That the physical presence of the byproduct helium-4 gas is a major headache to them. They cannot explain how in the world it could still be there in the original zircon crystals.
Actually, they can, fairly easily, and with better predictions than the models Humphreys tried to use. It's just that it doesn't come up much, because only creationists are stupid enough to think that they can break all of nuclear physics and thermodynamics by scratching their heads and saying, "Oi, that's a lot of helium, isn't it?"
So we not only have this evidence, but the fact that they can't correctly identify young rocks in the blind test. They always take them to be old.
Actually, no. It's the creationists who typically can't get their correct ages, and primarily because they are either amazingly bad at their jobs or are just frauds. I'll let the audience decide which one is more likely. Like when Steve Austin got all results from Mount St. Helens that were effectively the same age as zero, but had reported values of about 200,000 years, he took it as a refutation of radiometric dating, either not realizing that if you use a technique that is known to not work for what you want to do with it, and then it doesn't work, that you haven't overturned the technique, or just being a fraud. And then the one date that he did get back that wasn't just equivalent to zero, he had very obvious xenocrysts in his sample that would give him an erroneously old date, and his response was just, nuh-uh. It's not scientists who have trouble dating, it's creationists who seem to be the incels here.
And most of all, we have the evidence of the soft tissue, intact cell structure, and largely intact proteins, which simply could not have survived the ravages of thermodynamic decay and of ground radiation bombardment for anything more than a few 100,000 years.
No, we don't. They're not intact, and what we do have, indeed, could survive about forever.
This is sufficient evidence to completely destroy the evolutionary interpretation of the fossil record and the alleged geological column. It simply cannot be true. Something that outstandingly agrees with all this evidence.
Yes, in make-believe world, the evidence points towards a flood, because make-believe is what the flood is. Here in real life, though, sorry, there is no evidence for a global flood, and both literal and figurative mountains of evidence against it. And pretending that maybe electrons are shaped like a ring does not solve that problem.
Is a literal biblical global flood no more than about 5,000 years ago. That would explain why these fossils still have helium in them, because it hasn't been that long ago, not helium, but carbon-14, and would explain why the soft tissue, cell structure, and proteins are still largely intact. Again, there simply has not been enough time for them to have been degraded.
You serious?
And that's it. After this, he just tries to sell his DVD. I don't care about that. If you care about that, his DVDs are thousands, not billions, challenging an icon of evolution, questioning the age of the Earth, and The Case for Creation, Scientific Evidence for a Young Age of the Earth. Fun that he just stole the title of The Case for Creation from Lee Strobel's much more popular work, The Case for a Creator. But who cares? Probably not even Strobel. Well, I cannot say that I had denying the first law of thermodynamics or donut-shaped electrons on my bingo card. It was interesting to get some novel arguments at least, but that being said, virtually everything Kindle said was demonstrably wrong, and the rest was not helpful to his case. So, yet another pathetic showing from creationists. It's almost like all the evidence is against them. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, then please hit like on this video and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't, and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovind, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Eleron Teller, Phil Rivara, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostek Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Tapioca Weasel. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.